Hi, boys and girls. So we're starting a new chapter today. We're starting chapter 13. In chapter 12, we talked about ways that we talked about data, and we talked about how we can use a measure of center to describe that data set. We can use the mean, the median, or the mode. Okay, we're going to continue with that in chapter 13, and we're going to talk more about how to analyze data. So what can we learn as we look at the data? And today we're going to learn some new vocabulary words, okay? So looking at our first problem in lesson 13.1, if you want to hurry and grab your book, please do that. I think that's really helpful. It says, many lakes and ponds contain freshwater fish species such as bass, pike, bluegill, and trout. Jacob and his friends went fishing at a nearby lake. The dot plot shows the sizes of the fish that the friends caught. The lengths are rounded to the nearest inch. What patterns do you see in the data? Now, as you look at that data, boys and girls, it probably jumped right out at you that we had a lot of fish right here on our dot plot and a lot of fish right here. But in the middle, there were none. So what does that mean? Okay, remember on a dot plot that every dot represents a fish that was caught. And then on our number line, that was the length of the fish. So we had fish that were 5, 6, 7 inches, fish that were 11, 12, 13, and 14 inches. But there were no fish in the middle. When we have a spot like this in our data, boys and girls, we call that a gap. Okay, and that's what it says right here. It says a gap is an interval that contains no data. And it's easy as you look at that to recognize that there's a gap in our data. Okay, another vocabulary word that we're going to learn today is called a cluster. And a cluster is when things are grouped together. So as you look at that data on that dot plot, can you see some clusters of data? Areas where things are grouped together. In our book, it says a cluster is a group of data points that lie within a small interval. So we would say, boys and girls, this is a small interval of data. And so we would call this a cluster of data. So as we look at that, it says, does the dot plot contain any gaps? If so, where? Okay, it's easy to see that right here, there's no data. So we have a gap from 8 to 10, which means there wasn't really any medium-sized fish. We had small fish and we had big fish, but there really weren't any fish that were medium-sized. Okay, it also asks us about clusters. Okay, we had a cluster of data from 5 to 7 and another cluster from 11 to 14. Now, looking for those patterns in data can help you if you're trying to gather information from a data set. So for our next example, we're going to talk about symmetry. And symmetry is when something is the same on both sides. So if you were to take a piece of paper and fold it in half, and it was exactly the same, we would say that that has symmetry. Now, with data, boys and girls, it's not always exactly the same, but fairly similar. Okay, that's what we call symmetry when we're talking about data. So as we look at this histogram, it says, Erica made this histogram to show the weights of the pumpkins grown at her father's farm in October. What patterns do you see in the data? Okay, so as I look at that, boys and girls, I see that it goes from small to a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and then it starts to get smaller and smaller. Okay, when you look at this, it looks pretty symmetrical. I mean, this is a little bit more than that, okay, and this is a little bit more than that, but it's fairly similar. So we would say this graph has symmetry. Okay, it says identify any peaks in the data. Okay, a peak, boys and girls, is when something is just really tall. Kind of like when we talk about a mountain peak. If you're talking about a mountain peak, you're talking about the tallest part of the mountains. So when we're talking about data and peaks in data, we're looking for that tallest part. Okay, so it says the histogram has, when I look at that, boys and girls, it has one peak. One point when it's really a lot compared to the others. Okay, the interval representing the greatest number of pumpkins is for weights between 21 and 30 pounds. Now, it goes on to talk below, boys and girls, about changes across the intervals. And I've kind of already described that to you. Okay, so from 0 to 10 pounds, we had only 50 pumpkins. Okay, and then it increased and increased until we reached the peak. And at that point, once we get over here to 31 to 40, it starts to decrease. Okay, so what that tells us as we look at that data is we had a few small pumpkins, and then as they started to get bigger, there was more, and then in here is where the majority of our pumpkins were, and then after 30 pounds, they started to get less, and then after 40 pounds, even less. Okay? And as you look at that, boys and girls, we can see that it's very similar from the peak. If we were to take that graph and fold it in half, the sides wouldn't be exactly the same, but that they would be very similar. And so that's what we would call symmetry. We would say that this graph has symmetry. Okay, so today on your assignment, it's going to be focusing on those vocabulary words. Gap, where there's no data. Cluster, where there's data bunched together. Symmetry, and whether or not a graph has symmetry. It's also going to ask you about a peak. Remember, the peak is the tallest point. Sometimes we have two peaks, okay? And a peak is just a point that's a lot more than the other data, or there's a lot more data in that spot than in other places, okay? All right, if you have questions, reach out to your teacher.